So our main topic this week is going to be making 5e content versus making custom role-playing games. And we have a question from a listener that sort of just begins to touch on this topic. This is from Jim Klingler via our Patreon Discord. And there is conversation happening literally right now based on this topic in our Discord. So if you want to be involved in conversations like this, join our Patreon, you can join our Discord, and you can take part in these conversations. So this is Jim's question. I've been thinking about monster save proficiencies. One of my groups is level 12, and I'm noticing a pattern with higher CR monsters that aren't legendary. All of the proficiencies seem to be nerfed, making player control spells super effective. Fun for the players, but less fun for me. I also would argue powerful control spells get boring for the players if they succeed all the time. I can always add legendary resistances, but overuse of this tool can frustrate my players. I'm wondering if folks here fiddle monster save proficiencies to beef up the challenge for higher level PCs. Any thoughts? And this question is one of probably 10 million questions that you need to ask yourself when you're designing not just a new role-playing game, but even if you're making 5e compatible content. And a question like this comes to us as we break down what goes into role-playing game creation. So we'll table that particular question for now and get into this question of 5e content versus custom role-playing games. So I'm going to let you, James, sort of lead this discussion in whatever direction you want to start, and we can go from there, because we've got notes up in our show notes, but they're very general, and you could go a lot of different ways with this discussion, and I trust us as creators to do exactly that.
Yes, yeah. As creators and ramblers, we will. I'm sure we'll be all over the map here as we talk about this. But I think, you know, there is a big difference between creating for a game system that already exists and creating your own game system from scratch. And both have their merits, right? Both are cool and fun, and both have a laundry list of design and business reasons that you would do one or the other, right? And so, like, for instance, on the business side, which I think is good to touch on, one reason you would create for 5e is because we are in an industry where it's not Coke and Pepsi. It is Coke, and then everything else combined is like maybe Dr. Pepper, right?
Right.
Like, so there's a good reason to go make stuff for D&D because they have not just the market share, they control the market in a lot of ways. And that's one reason that it's easy to find people who want to pick up your thing. It is a game that, because it has so much money flowing into it, is designed rigorously, right? It's play tested really hard. It's got this team of full-time designers who look at it and try to make the best possible version of D&D that they can make. And that sort of saves you a lot of work. Whereas if you're making your own system, you are the design team.
Yep.
In many cases, and you may not have the support. You have to build that audience. You have to convince people to play it, right? All of those are no small feats when it comes to creating something. So those are sort of the biggest business reason. I mean, D&D also has like a zillion other things that support it. If you want to sell your product on Roll20, it's a lot easier to do that because they have the infrastructure for D&D or Fantasy Grounds or Foundry. If you want to put it up in a marketplace and not create your own marketplace, well, good thing that there's the DMs Guild. Good thing that there's, this. Of course, the other business reason that makes it hard is that, like, we don't know, right? We just had this whole thing happen with the OGL, and I think we do know with 5e, at least, that, hey, you're covered by Creative Commons, and they're never going to touch that again, and that's great. But what if when 5e 2e comes out, it is not as compatible as everyone is saying it could be, And it turns out that everybody switches over and plays that, and nobody's going to use your supplement then, right? Like, and 5e2e, let's say, has no open license or doesn't for a year and a half the way 5e did when it launched. There could be a lot of things there that means parts of the game you're designing for are out of your control business-wise too.
Yeah.
That's my business rant. Shawn, do you have anything to add on the business side?
On the business side, not really. The only other thing I would add, and you sort of touched on this, is the people can fall in love with a system. So 5e, taken out of the fantasy genre and put into a different genre, can gain traction because people understand the system. So you get Espergenesis, right? It's a 5e game, but it's not sword and sorcery. It's sort of science fiction fantasy. So that helps people say, oh, okay, I understand this. I roll a die, I add a modifier. I'm going up against a difficulty class, a target number. I've got that. That's why you see a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, because it's a system that people understand. You roll 2 dice, 2d6, you compare it to this chart. Do I succeed? Do I fail? Or do I succeed with this complication where I get to choose something or something automatically happens? And people understand that.
Yeah.
So it's not just the branding; it's also the underlying system that people can really enjoy.
Yeah, that learning curve, to eliminate that learning curve, I think, is very helpful and attractive to a lot of players. And it makes sense, right? Like, a lot of people just want to play. They don't want to spend 2 hours a week learning something for a month before they can play it. And that's often how it feels, especially if your first game, like many of us, is D&D. D&D is a very complicated game that has 3 core rule books that are 900 pages, and even just the player's handbook before you get to the spells is a lot of stuff to read. So there's, I think that can be intimidating. And if you know D&D and Powered by the Apocalypse, you can play hundreds of games, right? Why would you learn another one if you don't really like learning rules? Fair.
Right.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, too, that is true, though, is if you are going to pick 5e as a system to design something in, be it medieval fantasy, be it, be it a superhero game or a sci-fi game, you should take a page out of Espergenesis's book, which is that D&D is a game that primarily, for many groups, and primarily supported in the rules, you are fighting monsters, right? And so if you want to create a game that is about romancing bear druids, you might be better off creating your own system, because you're going to have to do a lot to make D&D work to be a romance or a criminal investigation or a, even a horror game, right? I've played a lot of Curse of Strahd, and Curse of Strahd is a horror for about the first 5 minutes. And then you run into your first group of wolves or zombies or vampire spawn, and you tear them to shreds, and you're like, oh, right, we're superheroes. I totally forgot that we are able to survive. Oh, wait, Fred died? Cool, I cast Revivify. Great, we're back on track, right? And so, like, keeping in mind that there's a genre that D&D really supports, and that is transferable to, like, superheroes, right? It's sort of this heroic fantasy game that you could transfer to superheroes. It doesn't translate as well to some other things, and so you want to keep that in mind with your rule set.
So we have some categories here that will sort of help serve as the overview for what you need to consider when you're designing for an existing system, and we're going to take 5e as that system because most people know it, versus those same categories when you consider creating your own custom game. So the first category is going to be the audience. What audience are you designing for? The audience that you design for will have expectations. So as we already said, 5e has its own audience already. It has its own expectations. So people, when they're playing 5e, will expect to roll a d20 and compare it to a number, and generally a success or a failure, And in combat, those success or failures will be smaller transactions within the larger combat, and those sorts of things are going to be expected. When you create your custom game, who is that going to be for? Because those expectations will necessarily guide your design. All of the things that we are about to talk about will be answered partially by who is your audience. Are your audience teenagers who have grown up with cell phones and watching a particular type of entertainment in a particular kind of way? Because they will have different expectations than 80-year-olds who have grown up playing just basic D&D.
Yeah. It's really interesting if you go back and look at some of the old articles, if you can find them, about the D&D Next playtest, right? They were sort of very open about this is for people who have played all editions of D&D. We want to see if we can make something that's going to appeal to people who've played 4th and people who played 3rd and people who played 1st. And can we make this game? And they were not sure, right? But it was basically like, we want to try to make a game that is the quintessential version of D&D, and it will be all things D&D to people, right? That was their design goal, and that was sort of their target audience. It has grown way beyond that audience for a lot of reasons, some of it being a rigorously designed system, some of it being Stranger Things and Critical Role. Whatever it may be, there's a lot of factors that came together and have really made this system successful. And I think one thing when you set out for your audience, and this is something that we're carrying through in everything, is like, so like we're making an RPG right now, and it is a cinematic, tactical, heroic fantasy game, right? So we have been explicit in that. And that helps guide us, like, who is our audience for that, right? Okay, so if we want it to be tactical and cinematic and heroic, we know from the beginning we want the players who like to play games on a grid, right? That it's fine then, because we've identified that as our audience, it's fine if you don't like to play on a grid, but it does mean that you may not play our game. And we have to be okay with that as designers because we're making that choice, right? We want people who enjoy, no surprise, heroic, over-the-top fantasy stuff, right? Because it's going to be that, like, we're not looking for, this is not a game about counting torches and counting rations and mapping out the dungeon that you are in, as a player to find your way back out. I love games like that, don't get me wrong, but that's not what this particular game is. So we sort of took a stance and said, like, this is the kind of thing we want to do with our game, and that has helped us find our audience and answer other questions that I'm sure will come up.
Oh yeah, so there you go. Perfect example of the difference between the existing system and the system that we're creating. So next, we need to look, and this sort of all melts together in some ways, the setting and the genre. What's the setting going to be? What genre are we trying to write in? 5e, the system that it was built for, is this medieval sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy system in a setting with no technology or very limited technology. Magic sort of can replace technology, but not completely, unless you're talking about Eberron. So, and if we had built 5e for Eberron specifically, as opposed to generic fantasy in the Forgotten Realms, then the design might be slightly different. So that's what you need to think of. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Wizards does that themselves. When they change a setting, right, they put out different rules, or little supplements that will go on top, right? Like, hey, for Dragonlance, your character is going to start with a feat if you use these Dragonlance backgrounds, because we expect you to be a little bit more heroic in Dragonlance, and also because we're testing things for 5e, 2e. So there's that sort of expectation, and that's where that comes in, where if you were going to make a game for 5e, and it was a film noir where you're like a hard-boiled detective, that's going to be a very sort of different game than D&D. And that's when you might say, I think I might want a different system here because I want something that's going to make investigation more interesting, more of a game for my players. And I want something where it's like, yeah, this guy could get, a detective could get hit by a gunshot and die, right? As opposed to I could fall 200 feet and live after, sixth level or whatever it is.
Exactly.
So.
And that's a great point, right? So let's break that down. That detective, that noir detective sort of thing. In those stories, in that genre, the main character generally fails constantly.
Yes.
They're constantly behind in the action. They're trying to catch up to things that are happening. They get to what they think will be a breakthrough in their case, and the person they're going to question lies dying in the alley before they can get there to talk to them. However, they find a matchbook that will then help them, right? So it's this feeling of always trying, never quite knowing the truth, always trying to catch up, always failing, but still persevering. And that 5e doesn't want that. 5e doesn't want that to happen. They want you to succeed on rolls. They want that. And then if you talk about combat, then that's, again, totally, as soon as you bring gunplay into it, it's a completely different
totally
thing.
different.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things is, if you think about it at the basic level in 5e, you are active. You're the instigators in a lot of cases when you're the heroes. You invade the dungeon, right? Like you go into the home and things, whereas in a detective story, you're reactive. The things are happening, and and it's only in the moment when you finally get ahead of it that the story really ends, because now you've figured it out. You've figured out the mystery. You've finally gotten ahead of it, and now things resolve. As opposed to D&D, where it's like, we are going to take matters into our own hands and kick some butt here, which works in a lot of genres, right? It's not limited to a fantasy setting, but it does mean that thinking about those guiding stars and the stories you want to tell are really important when you sit down to make your system. And I'm sure, this is one thing I want to caveat, I'm sure there's a lot of 5e products people can point to and say, like, this person made mysteries work, this person made blah 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 work. And I think that that's great too, right? I think, but that person did a ton of work in order to make those things work, and they built probably their own system that is on top of D&D, right? We did that with Warfare and Kingdoms of Warfare and Strongholds and Followers, and so it's definitely possible and it's fun to do. But at that point, you're basically making your own game.
It's true. That's true.
Yeah.
The next point on our list is conflict resolution. So.
Yes.
Stories are about conflict. Stories are about I came through like creative writing and teaching creative writing. So there's all these theories about, what is a story? What makes a story? And one thing that they sort of call it like the masculine story, which is it's all about conflict. Whereas if you get out of that system, it's all about connection versus disconnection. It's about people coming together, then people separating. And both of those things are true in conflict resolution, where we want in our story to understand, here's the conflict, here's the problem, how do we solve it? What is the resolution? And so your system, whether it's a 5e system where we already know what the conflict resolution system is, if you're going to do something different, how do you do it? What is the system that you're going to put in to tell us as the players and even as the game master, here's the conflict, here's how you resolve it?
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a big part of, we were talking about that binary pass fail earlier, and this also sort of relates to Jim's question that kicked off this segment, and that is a big part of conflict resolution in D&D is, do you do the thing or do you not, right? Do you hit or do you miss? Are you charmed or are you not charmed, right? There's no you get to control my move, but I get to control my action on my turn because I'm half charmed, right? Or you get to move me right now as a reaction, but on my turn I get to do this, even though I'm right. Like we don't have that gradation, and it's a good thing because it's already a complicated game, especially when it comes to combat, right? That would make it so granular; it would probably be very easy to break. Um, and but I do think about like if you want to tell a story that is like a Star Wars story, right? Your conflict resolution should probably involve luck. It should involve forces bigger than you, like the
Hmm.
Force, right? That should be kind of baked into the mechanics so that the players can feel that. If you're doing Lord of the Rings, you want things to be you want to feel like, hey, when I make a decision, maybe there's an easier way to do things. But if I take that easy way, it's corrupting my soul a
Hmm.
little bit, right? Like I'm feeling the pressure of the ring and the shadow and the enemy and that sort of thing. And I think Dread is a system that does this great. So Dread is this horror system that we've talked about on this show before. But
Hmm.
essentially, you build a Jenga tower, and the way you do things is you play Jenga. Right, when your player wants to do something, you grab a block, you put it to the top of the tower. If you knock over the tower, your character dies. It's made for really horror one shots, horror movies. Think about
Hmm.
that, where most people are dead by the end.
Yep.
Um, it's great because you feel that tension, right? And people have since used the tower to do stories about romance on a first date because the tension isn't that different. The nerves aren't that different from like a
Right.
horror movie, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so thinking about how can you make the players feel like they are in the genre of story you want to tell, like you are playing these kinds of stories, I think is really, really important. And your conflict resolution system is where that comes into play. So if you're doing D&D, you should know that it's like, hey, it's pass fail. It's sort of made for this pulpy action. It's either happens or it doesn't, and then we move on, right?
Yep. With that dreaded D20 die, which gives you a 5% chance per side increase or decrease as you move up or down the scale. I always think of the terrible RPG, the one where you tear the character sheet,
Yes.
as a great conflict resolution system that shows you getting weaker and weaker as you go through the story, and you succeed very much at the beginning, but as you get less and less actual physical character sheet as you tear parts away, uh, becoming less able to muster the force of will or the equipment or whatever you use the sheet for to be able to continue to succeed as these conflicts throw themselves at you.
Yes, it's great. And it's one of those one of the best things about that game is if you are going to basically be done, tear your character sheet to shreds and have no character left, you can wad up what is
Hmm.
left of your sheet and throw it at the GM.
Yep.
And if you hit the GM, you get to decide how your character goes out, right? Like, so you
Hmm.
can take the big bad with you, or you can. That's really fun. You can do the same thing in Dread. You can knock
Hmm.
over, if you intentionally knock over the tower, you get to decide how your character goes out as
Yeah.
opposed to the GM narrating it. It's cool.
Yeah. And as Teos and I have talked about other games, we've talked about other methods of conflict resolution with fate, the fate dice plus your fate points and all of those. So you're going to have to decide how you are going to get through those conflicts and how resolve those using what rules. Now I'm going to switch it up a little bit here. The
Oh,
next point
yes.
is character creation. So in any game, you are going to have to you have, allow the player to play a character. Now this
Hmm.
could be in D&D, you have a species or background or whatever you want to call that. It used to be called race and still is sometimes,
Yeah.
heritage, whatever. You have a class, you have a background, you have these things that all come together, choices you make to build your character. You have to decide how complex you want that to be, what will be involved in that, so that it can interact with the conflict resolution system in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And you have to think about so this is a huge point of contention when you're designing for 5e. If you're designing character options, right? And it sort of depends on how much of 5e are you using, right? So if you're doing Aspergenesis, you're creating all your classes from the ground up, right? If you're doing, hey, I am adding this, but I still want you to be able to be a cleric or a fighter or a rogue or a, right? You need to think about those existing options. And this is where things get tricky, is that D&D, particularly in its combat pillar, has a lot of rules and options already.
Mm-hmm.
You have 13 classes that all go to level 20, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of options. And you can multi-class,
Mm-hmm.
which means that there are near infinite combinations of characters you could create.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we create stuff at MCDM for 5e, we do a lot of rigorous playtesting because there are so many things, right? There's so many spells that your
Mm-hmm.
character could take. There's so many feats now your character could take just from official options, where it's almost impossible for one person to create a class with a couple of subclasses and then say, okay, this is going to fit in the game, and have it not break the game somehow, because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, actually, if I multi-class here, or if I become a wizard and I take this spell, and then I take this spell and this class feature that you've created, which you never intended to go together but
Mm-hmm.
can go together because of the way the game works,
Mm-hmm.
means that we have now broken the game and made it unfun for everybody. Okay, so we got to go back to the drawing board and figure this out. And it's that can be very frustrating. And so if you're using 5e, one thing I would recommend is think about that structure and think about, can you change that to suit you? Do you need 20 levels for your
Mm-hmm.
game? That's a lot of levels. How many, Shawn, do you think, of the millions of D&D players, how many 20th level rangers are actively playing in a game every month?
Yeah, not a lot, and we have
Yeah.
evidence to back up this, that most campaigns end by fourth level, much less eighth or 10th or 12th. And the slope is steep down about how many players continue to play those characters up until those higher levels.
Yeah, exactly. And so it becomes a thing where you're like, if you're working within the bounds of D&D and using the classes that are there are things where you'll be like, oh, well, this character should get this ability at 7th level. Well, actually, that's a 15th level barbarian ability, and so now you're eating the barbarian's lunch too early, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, it would be balanced though if I look at, yes, but so that's a big thing to keep in mind, and a lot of that has to do with D&D's target audience.
Mm-hmm.
D&D's target audience
Exactly.
expects a game that goes to 20 levels, right? They expect certain spells to be on there, and so that's one reason why what Jim is talking about is a little frustrating in terms of monster proficiencies, is
Mm-hmm.
because I think it is sort of, I would say a lot of people don't like it when the creature they control, be it a PC or NPC, is charmed or
Mm-hmm.
paralyzed or stunned, right? And yet people expect that to be part of the game because it's part of the game's legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this weird place you can find yourself in when you're designing in 5e, where you're like, I gotta contend with this thing that I don't like, and I either, to change it, I either need to create a bunch of caveats, or I'm basically creating my own system now
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a big part of it, is in character creation. That's where you can see a lot of those sort of frustrations when you're working in 5e.
So the next part I've put in is the story flow. And what I mean by that is you have all of these other parts coming together, but a story comes out the other end of this process. How
Yeah.
smoothly does that story flow? Now, some people don't care about the story per se. For them, whether they hit or miss is the story. But there are also other elements that come together that we talked about, character arcs and campaign arcs. So the question that you have to answer is how much time, how much energy, how much thought needs to go from all of this mechanical stuff that we're doing to getting to the story that comes out, the artifact of play, if you will, of all of these rules coming together and all of the conflict resolution systems and the character creation and the rules. and will it be pleasing to the audience, and will it resemble the setting or the genre that you have built for it?
Yeah, and that's a huge piece of this. This is one of your guiding stars, I feel like, for the structure of your game. And so when we in D&D, we look at D&D, D&D slows down when you get into combat, right? Because that is a very important part of the game, and we want the play by play, the moment by moment. It is slower than real time, right? You in a video game, often when you have combat, that is not the case. It's not slower than real time. So it's really, the rules are saying, okay, this is really an important thing. Everything slows down. Let's pay attention. Whereas something like travel or resting happens faster, much, much faster than real time, typically, because that's not what the game is necessarily about most of the time. And I think when you are creating your game, you want to say to yourself, what is my game about? And so if your game is a lot about combat and fighting monsters or fighting villains, right? And everything else can be handled with a pass-fail check in terms of the story, right? Then you have got yourself 5e might work great for you. If what you want to do is have a game where, like, so for instance, Blades in the Dark, right, has this system because it's about heists. It has this system for flashbacks for, like, oh, I actually bribed that guard before we got here, and so let's do a flashback where we role play that, right? That's the flow of the story where you can adjust it and things like that. And so one of the big things, and this is one of the fun parts about making a game, go consume a lot of media. That North Star, what is your game about? Is it, is your game a Western? Go watch a bunch of Westerns and see, like, how are those stories paced? How are they told? Read a bunch of comic books if you're going to do a superhero game. How are those stories paced, right? And get into okay, and then you'll be able to figure out, all right, so what should my game have? Well, it should have flashback mechanics, or these are the typical kinds of scenes we see, and this is how they're linked together and how they play. I feel like that's really important, and you can create mechanics that reward that, right? D&D pushes, if you were to play the traditional way with experience points.
Yep.
Right? It pushes you into the dungeon to fight that monster because that's the way you level up.
It's true.
So you can use those carrots to get people to engage with the game the way you want them to engage.
Yep. Another way to look at it is to ask yourself, the party has just entered the cave and there are a group of goblins. We will not know the result of this for a half an hour.
Yeah.
Is that the game you want? And for some people, they might say no, but then when you play it out, each individual action within that full half hour of combat is fun. So yes, it's actually what I do want. The answer might be no, and you mean it.
Yeah.
Right. I want to make one roll per character, and then we narrate what happens, and that's where we want our focus to be, is on some other aspect of it, and that's okay too. But you don't want a 5e system for that.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, that's a really good way to think of that, right? This is what's going, these are the things that are going to happen. How quickly do I want them to happen, and what is it like? Shadow Dark is an incredible system in that, like, torches burn out after 1 hour of real time. Well, that's really cool, and it's a cool way to keep the flow of the story going and make players feel that urgency in the story, right? So thinking about how are your mechanics going to get people to engage with the game. Tomb of Horrors is very different if after an hour of time you're completely in the dark.
Yes.
As opposed, you're not going to be touching everything with a 10-foot pole when you're playing that way. For
sure. Yeah, that's a marvelous point, and I had an addition to that, and it just went right out of my head, as it often does. But no, that's cool. The thing I was going to say is that sometimes you think it's a good idea, and you will say, okay, this is how my game will work, and people will say, ooh, I love this, and they will play it, and they will enjoy it. And then it comes time for the next campaign, and they'll be like, you know what? That was fun once, but I don't know if
Right.
we want to do that again. And so that's another thing to think about. Is this a game that you're creating that you want people to come back to and play again and again and again? Or is it something you want to play, oh wait, this was a fun one-shot game, fun one-shot campaign, but now we're going to move on to something else because there's a reason people keep coming back to 5e.
Right.
Right? There's a
Yeah.
reason that people come and play Fate over and over, or Powered by the Apocalypse games over and over, because there is a satisfaction with the way that I'm going to go move on to the next one, that the game loop works. Right?
Yes.
The game loop works in a way that is pleasing and satisfying. So people will come back to that as opposed to one that might be fun but loses that satisfaction over repeated uses.
Yes, absolutely. And that's and I think there are great one-shot games out there that you'll play and you'll remember forever.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not want to pick them up again. That's fine. There are films that I feel that way about, where I'm like, that was a great film, and I'm done now. I don't need to see that film again because I had the experience, and I'm not going to have that experience watching it again. And there are some films where it's like, I will have just as much of the same emotion as I did the first time I watched this. Or
Sure.
it's fun to watch again to see what's different, right? And I think that is a big part of role-playing games. The gameplay loop that we're talking about here is hugely, hugely important. D&D is a game that is built for campaigns, right? It's built for longer, even organized play. Organized play would be so much easier to run if they said, you show up, you play this, and you never play that character again, right?
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be as fun for people who are in organized play. And so everybody puts in the work to make these big campaigns because that's what D&D is. And if you're interested in a campaign, 5e is a great engine for that because they have this system for leveling up over the course of 20 levels, finding really good treasure, and advancing your character in a way that feels significant as you level up. And that's really, really important.
Yeah, and that's all built on this very simple game loop of you say what you're going to do. The DM tells you the situation. You roll the 20-sided die, you get the result, the situation changes. Boom. It's relatively quick and constantly dynamic. There's constant. Now, what the game loop requires is math, though. The game loop requires math both in terms of adding to that die, comparing it to a number, but also keeping track of hit points, because that's what the game loop is intended to have: characters or monsters doing damage to each other and reducing your hit points. And so the game loop itself is quite quick. It's just that you go, you do this, next. You go, you do this, next. So that's the game loop. It's quick, but it also stacks onto each other to make it long. Ironically. So that's why I think this sort of game loop is so attractive to people. It's because you can do a turn very quickly, but that turn is just one of many things that adds up to tell a longer story. Other games might have a game loop where you take longer to do a thing. So I'm going to roll these 2 6-sided dice. All right, that's quick. I add my number. Now I look on this move, on this chart for Powered by the Apocalypse. Okay, so most of the time I'm going to get something between a 6 and a 10. So I have to make a choice. Now, what's that choice going to be? Well, let's talk it through. If it's the volley action in Dungeon World, then you have these choices. You could either do a little bit of damage, or you could do full damage but lose an arrow. I'm not getting this exactly right, but there's a laundry list of things you can choose. So now you're slowing down each turn, but the game goes more quickly overall, even though an individual game loop turn is longer, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. That you can see that. Yeah, it's definitely that you should really perfect your game loop to a way that you want it when you're designing a game like this. And I like a game that has a pretty quick game loop like D&D, where you say, I see a thing, I'd like to do that thing, make a roll, let's narrate what happens, right? And continue on. But there's the greater game loop of kill monsters, get experience points and treasure, and level up too.
Right.
And so thinking of those loops of like, what is the story loop? What's the narrative loop? And what is the smaller gameplay loop, I think are really hugely important. And how do they play into each other?
Yeah. Yep. So think about that as you decide what you're going to create for your game. And you say roll, narrate. D&D does not necessarily benefit everyone from narration of every role, because there are so many roles. Like one of the horrible bits of advice you get are, well, you can role play during combat by describing your thing. And I'm like, that's cool for sometimes, but I'll tell you right now, I've seen players who narrate like every single thing they do. And if you're in a combat that lasts 12 rounds and there are seven players plus the DM is controlling 4 different monsters, if 11 people are describing everything they do for every role, unless they are the greatest storytellers ever, it gets a little repetitive, and it takes a combat that could last 10 minutes and makes it last 45 minutes. So, be wary of that. Understand that when you're creating your game. If you want it to spawn this narration, you're going to want to tweak it in a way that doesn't make it quite so repetitive.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved about 4th edition was the powers had these evocative names and often a little description that would describe what you would do. But just, the fighter had a power called Come and Get It, where they would essentially draw every nearby enemy to them and then attack them all, right? And it was like, well, you can see just from that name, what's happening, right? In the narrative. And so that is definitely a thing that you want to keep in mind. And I am a proponent of you can role play in combat, and I think the way you do that is through the choices you make in combat and not necessarily through describing everything, right? If you choose to run away, that's role play. If you choose to, hey, I'm going to use my trident here over my sword because it's more dramatic because my father gave me my trident. That's role playing, right? Yeah. And so, there's many ways to role play in combat that are not, I'm going to give a 10-minute description every time I swing my sword.
Yep. Yeah, and that's another point where all of these things come together is the choices that you give people to make during the game loop, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because if you give somebody 30 different choices, is one choice obviously optimal? Because then those other 29 choices don't necessarily matter. Unless you give a mechanical or a story reason, they're just going to do the thing that is the best choice for the most part. Yeah. If you only give 4 choices, but they are very dramatic, very either story or mechanically important, that's better than giving 30 choices where there's an obvious best.
Yes.
Just in general.
Yeah, that's totally true, right? Think of even when you look at feats in 5e, that's a great way to put it, right? Like there are some feats where it's like, well, this is a must-have, and there are some feats where it's like, well, why would I ever take this? I am a big proponent of eliminate the why would I ever take this or make them better.
Right.
You want things to feel equal and you want them to feel interesting. And I think one of the best points to ask people to make a choice is in character creation instead of in that moment at the table where it's going to slow things down, right? If you ask somebody, hey, when you level up, pick your spells, that's great. If it's, hey, I have all 300 spells in the player's handbook available to me and I have to pick which one to cast, that may seem fun, but it is not as fun.
Right. And that's why, when you try to make a super tactical game, it sounds good, but we're going to be keeping an eye on you, James Introcaso. We're going to be keeping an eye on you, and we're going to be judging you silently about your tactical game. And we want to know that really, is it tactical? Really? Is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I should say, when we say tactical, one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that we're talking about is we want a lot of movement
Mm-hmm.
in combat. We don't want it to be both sides run together and hack and slash until one falls.
Right.
We want it to be there's a reason to keep moving around and it feels dynamic. And
Mm-hmm.
so dynamic may be a better word, but positioning matters in that
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Okay.
Not in the sense of like, well, now I need to decide, am I going to hit you in the knee or the elbow or the lip?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're not getting that granular with it because that is not as fun. So it's still a role playing game and it's
Yeah.
not a war game.
Okay.
That's an important thing to think
Mm-hmm.
about when you're designing a game, right? Like that's a big important thing for us is where is the line? Where is it too much? And that's why we put cinematic in there as well, right? Because
Right.
we want it to be fun and like you're in a movie and not just Shawn and I are at the table pushing things around like generals in World War II with with the
Mm-hmm.
sticks as we try to figure out how do we take back the front or whatever.
Yeah. And no, I wasn't alive then, so you can
You were not.
save all your jokes out there on the internet. Thank you. Okay, and the final thing that we have here are pillars. So D&D came right out and it said these are the pillars of play: combat, exploration, and then social interaction became role playing.
Right.
But and we know that combat is the most important pillar because there are so many pages in the rules for it. It's been a big part of the history, and it tends to be what most people gravitate toward, even if they like the other pillars. Role playing, again, time slows down and we spend a half hour on what would be 30 seconds of time in the game. So you have to ask yourself, are those the same pillars that you want in your game? And if so, how much space, how much bandwidth, how much thought are you going to put on those in those other areas of character creation, of conflict resolution, of game loop, of story flow? How much of the brunt, how much of the grist of this game is going to cover those pillars? And are you going to create completely new pillars? Are you going to have a romance pillar where it is a combination of exploration and role playing? Are you going to have, or is it like combat and role playing? Is that how you do it, right? A professional wrestling game might be a little bit different because of various things that you try to do. So you can ask yourself those, what pillars am I going to highlight and how does it affect the rest of my design?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a big thing. I get when I talk about combat being like an important part of D&D and a pillar that I believe is weighed heavier than the other two. Sometimes people online get upset and they're like, well, you need more rules for combat to be fair, is sort of like what they say. And I get where they're coming from for that. But that's because combat is very important in D&D, and so we
Right.
want it to be handled fair. And there are games that handle social interaction, right, where it might be like, we are going to spend a half hour on this conversation that in D&D would take 5 minutes because of the way the rules work and because this is a game in the style of, Emily Bronte,
Right.
and it really matters the way that this is happening, right? There's a game called Bubble Gumshoe, which is a gumshoe system, and it has some light rules for combat, but you're high school students, and so fighting gets you in a lot of trouble if you do it. And so all of the rules there are about investigating mysteries and social interaction and like spreading rumors. There's this whole thing you can do called Throwdown, where you like spread rumors throughout the high school to destroy your enemies basically and embarrass them, and they try to do the same to you, and like that in D&D would be one skill check, right?
Right.
And so I think it's important to think about what is your, for lack of a better term, combat, right? What is the thing that you want your game to do really well, and you want people to build characters and say like, yeah, I want to be really good at sewing if your game is about sewing, right? Or I want to be really good at hip hop dance because this is a game about dance competitions. Whatever it may be, you should think about like, how can we make this interesting and fun and a game, right? And in D&D, that's combat, and I think that that's great. But you could make combat a single roll, just like a skill, and say, hey, if you fail this, all you need to say is you don't die, right? Like if you
Right.
fail this, or maybe you do if you want it to be a super deadly game. So, yeah, it's up to you.
For sure. I mean, you make one roll. If you do really well, you take no hit point damage. If you do poorly, you take more hit point damage. And then we move on
Right.
to the next combat or the next encounter or whatever. You could totally do that. But would that reduce the fun for the audience? Most likely. So there you
Correct.
go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
That's
Yeah. We've covered a lot. We've covered a lot,
we have.
and we could
I've
go.
kept you here a long time, Shawn. I apologize.
I think it's the other way around, but I so much appreciate you coming on to the show. Anything else you want to talk about this before I get to the closing and then let you give your bona
Yeah.
fides?
I think I just want to say to Jim's question.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like, what are some ways to make it interesting to have monsters who can fail or who can succeed on a check, but then the players don't get frustrated because none of their spells ever work? Is I think if you want to boost up saves or give them legendary resistances, you can have monsters succeed at cost.
Mm-hmm.
So guess what? Your monster can succeed points, or they gain a level of. They cost them a spell or a breath weapon recharge, whatever it is. We did that in Flea Mortals, and it was really successful because it meant that like these dominate monster matters now when I cast it, even if they fail against it and use a legendary resistance, something cool is happening. So I think one of the things you want to keep in mind is that D&D has this system that is made for combat to go quickly, which means that something does not happen every turn. There are some turns where nothing the status quo does not change. But that can be frustrating and boring for some people. So think about ways that you might change this particular instance. And the reason I bring that up is for a shame it so that something happens on every turn, even if it's just a little bit of damage or a little bit of movement or something like that. And so far, we've been successful, and I'm excited for people to check out the MCDM RPG whenever it rears its
Beautiful.
ugly head.
Beautiful. It's beautiful, sophisticated, well-designed head. Yeah. You broke up a little bit there during that final thing, but I think everyone got the gist of what you're saying, and when it comes out, we will make sure to highlight everything that you just mentioned in your new book, Flea Mortals, and in your upcoming game that we will be hearing about from Matt repeatedly, whether it's ready to be talked about or not.
Yes, exactly. So cool. Shawn, thank you so much for having me on. I'm so appreciative. This was a great conversation.
I agree. It's always a pleasure chatting with you about role-playing games, and I hope our listeners enjoyed it. And I want to thank our listeners for being supportive, for listening to our nonsense, and some of them even give us a little bit of money to do this. So I want to thank our patrons. We have Master of Dungeons supporters who share their stuff with us, and I appreciate that. Special shout out to our Master of Realms supporters in our show notes here, and for our Masters of the Universe, they get a special shout out on the show. So we have Keith Amon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Andy Edmonds at thenerdronomicon.com, Paige Lightman and Ben Heisler. I did that backwards this time. Sean Hurst, Brian King, Jim Klingler aka DM Prime Mover. Thank you for your question. Travis Lee, Chad Lench, the Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, the Micro Ant, Sean Molly. You know Sean. Falcon Neal, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Krishna Simone, say whatever you want, Joe Tyler, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you to all our listeners and our patrons. You out there listening, can become a patron by going to patreon.com/mastering D&D. So, James, where can people find you and your work?
So while it exists, I'm on Twitter. See twitter.com/James Introcaso. I'm also, I stream on Twitch. My channel is James Introcaso, my name. And I just want to take a quick moment here, Shawn, to remind everybody to back your Kickstarter that is ending soon. If you're listening to this the day it comes out, so everybody should head on over to the show notes for this episode and check out the Kickstarter that Ghostfire Gaming has. You got a few precious moments to get in there, so go check it out.
I appreciate that. And you can follow the show, of course, on, as James said, Twitter while it's still there, at Mastering D&D. You can find me on Twitter as well, at Shawn Merowin. We're on Mastodon as well, YouTube, all the places that you can find us. Just yell really loud out your window, and with my super hearing, I will hear you and come running to your RPG rescue. So, James, we've done recording. We have talked and talked and talked about creating your custom role-playing game. What are we going to do now?
Go romance some bears.
Yeah.